I do want to make sure that this session tonight just has a little bit of interaction. I always think it's better for you and better for everybody else if we get to some questions and comments and a little bit of lively discussion. So please, as I'm going through, if there are issues that I raise that you would like to talk about, or if there's things I don't mention but about which you have curiosity, within reason, I'm happy to take questions on anything. I've titled my address to you tonight, "The Lighting of a Flame," because this is one of my favourite quotes about education, and it is that education is not the filling of a pail but the lighting of a fire. I don't attribute it to anyone because there's some dispute about it. It was introduced to me as a quote from W.B. Yeats, but when I look it up, there's an entire academic set of theses on whether it was really from him or someone else, so I'm not going to enter into that. But I did try as Education Minister to hold on to what I think is the central truth of this quote, and that is that the business of education is not simply about filling an empty vessel with facts, but about igniting a way of thinking and a love of knowledge and a curiosity about the world. And when you are on the receiving end of endless campaigns about what education should be and what schools should be doing, as so many of our teachers and educational leaders and those of us who have the opportunity to either be Director Generals or Ministers of Education, it can be very easy to slip into, what are the 10 things children need to know before they graduate? And I always used to say to myself, don't think like that. What are the 10 things children need to feel? What are the 10 things, that they need to be excited about, not what are the 10 facts they need to know? You don't always succeed in that, of course, but as I wanted to start with that because it gives you a bit of a sense, I hope, about the approach that I took to the portfolio of education when I held it in the Queensland Government. As you can probably tell by now, I am not giving a lecture tonight where I'm going to read to you from a long and lengthy speech. I think my value in an environment like this is I'm speaking to an audience of leaders, and I intend to offer you some of my reflections at quite a personal as well as a political, social and structural level about the experience of leadership. Now that I'm a little bit away from particularly my education reforms, some of my reflections on those things that I think worked, those things that are worth remembering if you ever had to try it again, and a little bit of, hopefully inspiration to you about what can be done when you apply your mind. So I will be talking very much through the lens of leadership. In my view, leadership is always really a discussion about change. It doesn't matter what you call it, can be called reform, but leaders are people who are wanting to take us in a new direction, people who want to invent the next step. Leaders, for me, are people who are future makers. And in that regard, I would like to congratulate ACEL on naming this lecture after Hedley Beare. Hedley was someone who was undoubtedly a future maker in the education sphere of our nation. And when you make new futures in something as powerful as education, then you actually change the country. So Martin, I hope you feel a great sense of pride about your father's achievements. I'm very pleased that you could be here. Martin introduced himself to me in the lobby. It turns out I once gave Martin an award when he was working in the health department in the IT section. So I can't claim to have remembered that moment, but I will remember this one, Martin. So thank you for introducing yourself. I acknowledge all of the achievements that Jim listed that go with the name Hedley Beare. But I would like to add to them probably the thing I admire most about him, because it's the thing I personally find most difficult in life, and that is the ability to keep your mind open and to think about things in new and different ways. From my experience, that gets harder and harder as you progress through life. You start to get very set in a certain way of thinking, very much informed by your own experience of the world and of life. And everything I've seen of Hedley's work is that even very, very late in his career and quite late in his life, he was talking about inventing and reinventing the future. And I think if more leaders could keep that focus, then we would all be in a very different place. So the things I'm going to talk about this evening: major education reform. I'm going to talk, I could have picked a number of different things. I'm just going to talk specifically about the prep year, some of the lessons along the way, and hopefully some of those things are helpful to you in your deliberations. touch very, very quickly on school transformation. I want to talk a little bit about leading in crisis, because it doesn't matter where you are as a leader. If you are a leader, you're dealing with a crisis somewhere in your leadership journey, if not every day, then much more frequently than you would prefer to. And close with just a little bit of thinking about what it means to be a future maker in education at the moment. So when we decided to introduce a preparatory year of schooling in Queensland, it was in the context of a number of things. Firstly, at the point that I became Minister for Education in 2001, our state had one less year of schooling than every other state in Australia, and our children started school almost 12 months younger. So they graduated from high school almost 12 months younger with one less year of education. And the year they were missing was what I think everybody in the world understands from all the evidence, the most important year, and that was that foundation year of early childhood, of very good quality, powerful early childhood education prior to entering year one. So we took in, I came into the portfolio, thought, what needs to be done here? Put together a broad package of reforms. PrEP was the introduction of PrEP, or the proposed introduction of PrEP at that stage was one of them. The learning and earning reforms were another, and a very significant commitment to putting digital at the heart of Queensland schooling was another. So I just put there that it was part of a broader package, because I think many of you will often be in the situation where you have to do something quite big and momentous, but you've also got a whole lot of other things you've committed to or have been committed to you, and you have to get done. It was in the context of the Peter Beattie's Labor government, which at the time was taking as its theme song a quest to make Queensland the smart state of Australia. This fitted perfectly with my aspiration to fix the problem, the gap in Queensland schooling, because I made the obvious point, it's very hard to claim that you are the smart state of Australia when your kids have one less year of education. So it was very, very nicely dovetailed with an opportunity for reform. Just as a very brief aside, it's a fascinating history about why Queensland ended up in that position. It wasn't always so. Immediately after the Second World War, when there were many demands on the Queensland government, as there were on state governments everywhere, particularly around the need for public housing, a government was elected that promised to introduce universal public high school. So seriously, post-World War, Queensland did not have universally available public high school. You needed to get a scholarship to go to a grammar school if you wanted to progress. And so they were under a lot of pressure, didn't quite get there at the end of their first term. It became a very difficult political issue for them in their next election. And so they solved this problem in their next term of government by passing a piece of legislation that unilaterally declared every PrEP kid a year one kid, every year one kid, a year two kid, and so on up the line, and suddenly you had year eights. And that's how Queensland got its first universally available public high schools. But it was something that was never remedied. What's most fascinating to me about it is that if you go back to the Hansards, there is almost no debate about it. And if you can even imagine an education minister standing up and making such a declaration now, it gives you a sense of how much the world has changed, and I think how much the involvement of parents and the public interest in education has changed. What we committed to, or what we proposed at that stage, we weren't in a position financially to commit at that stage, but I knew that if you didn't start talking about it and building an expectation, you'd never get there. So we started talking about the need to fix this gap in our system. And what it meant was that we would need to put in place an extra year of schooling in every single primary school in Queensland, not only in every public, Catholic and independent primary school, but we would have to do it in some of the most remote places on earth. We had to do it in our schools of distance education, in remote Indigenous communities, in one-teacher schools, of which Queensland has quite a number. It would mean new facilities in almost all of those schools. Of course, there were some schools that had spare capacity and could accommodate it, but most needed new. Very cutthroat negotiations with the non-government sector about those facilities. It needed new curriculum, and it wasn't just that you could put in a new curriculum for PrEP, but of course you had to think about whatever you put in for PrEP would then have a knock-on effect into the year one curriculum, the year two curriculum, etc. You needed to recruit and train additional teachers, and you needed to get the public ready for something that was quite a significant shift. And from a public perspective, one of the biggest shifts was that we altered the school entry age so that Queensland children were entering their first formal years of schooling at the same age as other children around the country. That was quite important from a national perspective. You can't do national comparisons. You know, the first, prior to NAPLAN, the previous comparisons of schooling systems, Queensland always came at the bottom of the list. No surprise, you know, our children were a year younger, they'd had a year less of schooling. We had to fix that school entry age. But I'm sure many of you can remember back to having your first children and being ready for when they would enter school. Families make huge plans around when they anticipate their youngest child or their child is going to move into this formal schooling system. It's when a lot of mothers decide they're going to go back to work or they're going to change from part-time to full-time. Families often plan significant family holidays, either, you know, prior to or, you know, in line with what they anticipate is going to be that first year of schooling. So along comes the government and decides to change that in a relatively short period of time, and that caused quite a bit of disquiet. So in terms of, you know, some of the lessons, when I look back on that, why do I think ultimately we managed to achieve it? As you can imagine, this was an incredibly expensive initiative. It was not, you would think adding a year of schooling would be wildly popular. It wasn't necessarily, and I'll touch on that. So firstly, these are very big systems. There are few systems that are as big as the education system, and there are few that have the amount of public interest in them that the education system does. So the first lesson is go the distance. Easier said than done. This initiative I announced in 2001. It became universally available in every primary school on the first day of school in 2007. We did implement a range of pilots that meant that every year we were putting maybe 25 or 30 new schools into the system, and that was very important, but it did not become universally available till 6 years after we started talking about it. I was minister from February 2001 till the middle of July 2005. Thankfully, I was then in Treasury where I could still keep a very good eye on what was happening and had obviously a very big interest in it being realised. You know, at a political level, I think, you know, one of the things that concerns me is that if you look at the really big service delivery portfolios that matter to every single one of us as citizens at a state level, things like health, transport, education, and just think about how often those portfolios change minister. It is very difficult to do something this big unless you have serious continuity of leadership. And I was lucky enough to have that, lasting more than, you know, one term, got through more than 1.5 terms in government. Is that a hand up already?
I don't mind. Steve Rudolph, I was the principal or the head of college at St Peter's Lutheran College at Indooroopilly, and you came to visit the prep centre at Indooroopilly because they had decided to run it earlier. But I just want to draw on your comment there about having a Minister for Education for some amount of time, about 4 years, I think.
4.5, yep.
I think we have across Australia at state levels as well as federal. I think that's a real challenge that I'm now the Executive Director for Lutheran Education Australia. So I try and work out who I'm dealing with at a federal level and my regional directors at a state level. The seats change too often, the people change too often, and I think for education to have a proper debate that you need to have 1 or 2 people dealing with for some period of time. I think that's a real issue that we have in education, that we change seats too often.
Look, I couldn't agree more. However, I also know, and now having had experience as a Premier where you have to put together a cabinet, I think you would want a leader, whether a Prime Minister or a Premier, to put one of their top 3 or 4 people into a portfolio like education. And unfortunately what that means is that when there's a vacancy created a little higher up the chain or in a very big problem area, you are tempted to move some of your best people into them. So I appreciate both sides of the fence, but that's why I raise it here, because I think it's an important public discussion, particularly for a leadership organisation like yours to have. You know, some of you are regularly talking to people like premiers and prime ministers, whether formally or informally. And if you ever get a chance to them saying, if education matters to you and you want to do big things in it, leave, if the person's any good, you know, leave so-and-so there for another term, because there's such big portfolios, it takes you 12 months to climb the hill. In Queensland, we have 3-year terms, so you get 1 year at doing something and then you're into an election year. Same federally. So to do big reforms like this that have long-lasting legacies and change the way the show operates, you're turning around a big ship. So that's why I raise it. It required enormous focus. I'm sure you're aware, whether it's at a school level. I suspect there are some very big similarities between being Minister for Education and being the principal of a school. I came into the portfolio, starry-eyed with, a lot of reformist zeal and enthusiasm and passion about how education transforms lives, as I'm sure principals do when they go into those roles and teachers. I can tell you I spent more of my time about toilets in schools than I ever want to contemplate again. You are the operational weight of a big system like this, the operational weight of running a big school can really. The challenge is to keep in the helicopter and to fight against that operational weight as often as you can, and that focus, bringing that focus to the fore, is the only thing that will drive the people under you who have to actually make it happen. If you want to, a big reform, as I said, often takes a lot of time. In our case, it meant, running lots of pilots across the state, across each sector of schooling, and each has its own flavour and its own issues to deal with. Managing to get through successive state budgets, the money we needed for new pilots, for new facilities to actually get the whole thing going. It went through 2 elections and ministerial changes. I've coined this one, got enemies. There's a great Winston Churchill quote, and it says, got enemies, good, it means you've done something. And he's absolutely right. There's only, particularly in politics, there's only one way to please everybody, and that's to do nothing, and then that ends up upsetting them eventually. So reformers have to know how to have enemies and how to understand that there will be criticisms, there will be resistance to change, there will be people who will try to undermine things when they're moving on. So, as I said, you would expect that a reform like this, an extra year of education, would be a widely welcome thing. There were very different camps on this. Preschool teachers who had been in our previous preschooling system, that was a half-time offering available to less than 30% of children in the age cohort, were very wedded to the model that they had. And we couldn't simply double that model and roll it out everywhere. We had to change the model. And so we had a whole contingent of early childhood teachers who were very distraught about a new system coming in, and they had a very significant degree of influence within the Teachers' Union. While the Teachers' Union, of course, always like having more teachers because it means more members, they have to deal with their constituency. I understand how that works. And so while they never came out and vigorously opposed the reform, at no stage did they ever come out and support it either. And that, in my view, that was not a demonstration of leadership. I think they would have done themselves, their organisation and their broader members and and the public a much greater service if they had been prepared to take their resistant members on a journey and help them understand how this would actually change the whole system. Generally speaking, parents were supportive, but there was a group of parents whose first children were only 2.5 or 3 years old when we were talking about these reforms. And having been a mother, I know that when your first child is 2.5 or 3, it is simply impossible to imagine them being 5. You think they're just going to be a slightly taller version of this, of a 2.5-year-old. And so those parents felt very strongly that putting their child into a full-time year of preparatory education was potentially robbing them of their childhood, that somehow these children would not be ready for it, because we did not propose, for example, to have sleep time as they had got used to in preschool. These were really emotional discussions. And it's very hard. It was very interesting. Everybody who had children who were older than 5 were great supporters of it, because almost universally those parents talked about how ready their children were for school, how much they loved being at school, how much they enjoyed formal education, and how they think they would have actually been even better prepared for it if they'd had a stronger early childhood preparation. So parents were a mixed group. Thankfully, those whose eldest children were 2.5 or 3 were a minority, but there was a couple of them that were incredibly well organised and ran a very long campaign against prep year. there were different schooling systems here. There was public, independent and Catholic. And there was a great deal of concern, as you can imagine, in the non-public parts of the system. Thankfully, in Queensland, we enjoy a very strong relationship, working relationship. There's healthy competition for student enrolments, but a very good professional working relationship between the systems, and that really mattered. But that doesn't mean there weren't some very hairy moments that involved bishops and other things. And of course, Treasury. It's not that Treasury are anti-education. Treasury are just opposed, ideologically to spending money on anything ever. And so every single part of this was a fight with Treasury where they would be nickel and diming. And I remember thumping the table because they wanted to get rid of the covered walkways between the prep schools and the toilets and the main schools. And I'm saying, great, we'll send the 4.5-year-olds to the toilets in torrential rain in Queensland. How do you want to sell that? So there were those kinds of arguments. But as I said, you cannot do anything unless you're prepared to take on enemies and be criticised. So some of the things that were really important and worked for us was we decided that we really had to tell the story of success as it unfolded. One of the great things about having 5 years to do this was there were lots of stories that you could tell. The pilots gave us endless stories of success, and we didn't have to tell them. It was parents and teachers who started to tell the stories. And there is nothing more powerful than the word of mouth among parents, particularly in regional communities or in suburbs that have a very community feel to them. What we started to see was parents shifting enrolments away from schools that didn't have pilot sites into schools that did have pilot sites, and to the point where there was in a couple of places we had to put pilot sites in order to avoid serious enrolment distortions. And we got great cross-fertilisation between the pilot sites and between schooling systems. And as people started to tell the stories of what their prep kids were doing compared to... Because many of the teachers were formerly year one teachers. And I remember one year one teacher, one prep pilot teacher tell me, she said, I used to have a list of 20 things that I wanted my year one kids to be able to do by the time we got to Easter. And she said, my prep kids are doing all of those things long before Easter, and I think we've held those kids back. And, really it had changed her whole view of early childhood education. You cannot overestimate the importance of building an army when you want to make a big shift. In our case, while we didn't have the active support of the teachers' union, and we had a cohort of teachers who were actively opposed, we had the universal support pretty much of principals who have big professional associations who are very influential in their school communities. So when mums and dads said, I'm worried about this, you had an army of champions out there. And it's much more powerful having a principal tell a worried mum why they think it's good to have a prep pilot site than it is having a government official or a minister talk about something that's a government initiative. Every single parent of a prep child in those pilots, and the pilots just became an incredibly important part of rolling this out because every single parent became a champion of it. They were going to their play groups, going to their mothers' groups, going to the P&C, going to their tennis and telling everybody, particularly those who had had children grow through the system without prep. They were the most powerful storytellers because they could give concrete examples about how it had changed. And then put all of that together. And then local MPs, of course, all started competing. Even opposition MPs started lobbying me because they wanted to be in the next round of pilot sites. And all of that together and combined started to create an unstoppable momentum. That even if the government had wanted to say, actually, this is all too big, we can't do it, politically it just became impossible. It had a momentum about it that it had to be finished. Not everyone can build an army. You don't need to build an army that big, but in a school context, you want to make a big change, then you have to, I always say to people, think about who your army is before you do it. And in a school environment, obviously, it's key people on your P&C, key parents who are good chatterboxes at the school gate, maybe local business people if it's a high school program in, an employment, whatever it is. Think about who your army is first, because without an army, and things will go wrong and you'll be out there on your own. So it was a big, incredible reform. It's made a lasting difference. The first prep kids don't graduate from a Queensland high school with the full 13 years of education. 2019, I think, Jim, or 2020. Yeah, maybe 2000. We can't even do our maths. We're not a great advertisement. But, you know, it's one of those reforms that takes a generation. But what I can say is that all the results that we're getting in primary school is actually proving the worth and proving up the international research about early childhood education. I wanted to talk very, very briefly about school transformation because I never want to miss the chance to tell this story. Some of you may know it. There is a school in South Brisbane, not very far from the South Bank, for those of you who know Brisbane's geography, called Buranda State School. It's a very old inner city school, and it was in the middle of my electorate. When I became the member there, one of the first groups that came through my electorate door was a group of parents and teachers from Buranda State School. At that time, it had less than 50 enrolments, and they knew that if they could not increase their enrolments, that they would face closure. I worked with the education department, who all just kept telling me I was a new nobody backbencher. Yes, we have a formula, and once that school, if they get to 45, they will be set for closure. And we can't sustain that in the inner city. You all know the arguments. They did, however, then put in place a new principal called Lynn Hinton. Lynn has subsequently retired from the school. This is all in the late 1990s. And I always like to tell the story because it's such a powerful story of a school turnaround. And like all inner city schools, it had a big cross-section of demographics and socioeconomic capability, big serious problems, some families with a lot of capability and everything in between. Lynn introduced a primary school curriculum in philosophy. In Lynn's case, it was because she was passionate about philosophy. It doesn't have to be philosophy, but something that the principal was absolutely personally passionate about, something she was able to ignite her teachers about, to persuade parents about, that gave her school something unique about it, but importantly it gave the whole school environment or the whole school community a clarity of purpose that it hadn't had before. For 5 years they'd been sitting going like this, watching the enrolments decline. And what Lynn gave that school was the most extraordinary leadership. I've never seen any organisation turn around as quickly as this one. I could have given you another couple of examples of schools that changed principal that went quickly downhill at just about the same rate as this one went uphill. You can Google this school, and Lynn's written extensively on her experience. But without very much population or demographic shift in this suburb, within 6 years, Lynn's school was being enrolment managed. That school now has extensive waiting lists. If you live outside of the catchment, you almost find it impossible to get in, and there are a number of families that move into the catchment to get their children into this school. They now have a school enrolment of more than 600 children. It was a big inner city school, and it had got down to under 50. So it is just a great story that tells you schools can be transformed. I never want to miss the chance in a room full of education leaders. One thing we're not very good at, I think, in this system is taking the examples of excellence and learning how to replicate them across other schools and other systems. But the children, I know many of my friends have children who've gone through that school, and it is a remarkable example of institutional turnaround. I wanted today to talk a little bit tonight about leading in crises. Firstly, because many of you, that's how you will know me, if for better or for worse. It's how I'm going to be remembered. But I learnt a lot about from that event. But by the time I'd got to that event, where many people will have a very clear image of a big crisis that I, along with others, was managing and leading, you can't sit in a position of leadership, as I had as a minister in a number of different portfolios, for almost 16 years by the time that, or 15 years by the time that crisis came along. Being a leader means you manage and lead crises on a constant basis. If you're in a position of leadership, then part of your job is to also look for other leaders in your organisation. And what I look for is the person in the room who walks towards the problem. It doesn't have to be a massive natural disaster for it to be a crisis. The photocopier can break down. The toilets stop working, in a school full of 700 children. You've got a crisis. Terrible accidents happen in schools, as you know. And you can, if I say to you, whenever you have a big problem like that, you can almost see people quietly inching back Not me, don't pick me, I don't know what to do, and that's okay. The person who actually just walks confidently up to that problem and said, right, this is what we should do, who not only walks towards it with some courage, but walks towards the problem because they derive personal satisfaction from grappling with problems and solving them and helping other people find their place in the solution. That's, in my observation, one of the ways to tell a leader in the room. That means that a crisis should never be wasted. I never write that down because I never want it to be misunderstood. I'd never wish a crisis on anybody. But if you're in a position of leadership and a crisis falls on your watch, the way that you deal with it will tell everybody under your, in your authority, under your watch, something about the kind of leader you are. If you want to execute a very big reform and you want to do a big change in your system or your school, and you want to take people to go over the hill with you, but you let them down when the toilet block burns down and you're not there, then you'll never convince them to take a big reform step with you. Whatever the crisis is, whether it's big or very, very small, if you're not the person that they can look up to and say, they were there when I needed them, when I was frightened, when I was fearful, when this terrible thing happened, they were there. And they knew what to do, and I knew with confidence that if I followed them, I'd be safe. If you can't be that person in the crisis, then asking that same group of people to change their working hours, to implement a new curriculum, you'll never get them over the line. This is the quote that Jim referred to before. This is one of my favourite leadership quotes. I didn't actually hear it until after the disasters in 2011. And one of the reasons I liked it so much was because it was so resonant of the experience that I had in 2011. When those big natural disasters hit, it did feel like, why isn't there a recipe book? Page 58, massive natural disasters. If there is a really good and comprehensive rule book, then most intelligent, capable and diligent people know what to do. It is when you face a situation which has never been faced before or for which no one's ever contemplated a set of rules or responses that, again, as I said, you find the leader in the room. So when you don't have a rule book, what do you rely on? I don't have all the answers, but the experience that I had in that very big, very public situation, the best word I can find for it is instinct. And it's a very hard to define word. And what I mean when I say that word to you in this context is all the layers and layers of life experience that had been laid down in me in the many, many years leading up to that point, that gave me the confidence that when I made the call, when I made the decision, that whatever it was on that particular day, that it was as close to right as it was going to be and the best that I could make. And a crisis, one of the definitions for me is an extreme set of circumstances where you will be making high-stakes decisions in suboptimal circumstances. You will be making some of the highest stake decisions you've ever made in a set of circumstances where you're very unlikely to have all the facts and very unlikely to have the opportunity to talk to someone with more expertise in it than you, to seek the advice of your peers and to find a rational way through it. You will have to go with what you've got in a very constrained period of time, and the outcome of your decision is going to be very high stakes. And that does require a lot of personal sort of confidence and sense of purpose that is very hard to buy off the shelf. It's very hard to gain in a leadership training course. But I think that there is something about life that layers it down in you. There are many other things you can learn in MBAs and training courses and the sort of skills development that we do with senior leaders. But I always say to people, it's just as important what you do outside of work. It's just as important that you challenge yourself. Whether it's the experience of getting through childbirth or climbing a mountain or finishing a marathon or learning a new language or starting a new relationship, it's life that actually, it's those big, courageous, stretching decisions that when the big crunch comes, they're the ones that I found myself thinking, I can get through this because I got through that other thing, or I can make this decision because I've made these other decisions. So for those people who aspire to leadership, I think one of the best things and one of the best advice we can give them is, yes, do all the things you need to do at work, but what are you doing outside that is going to stretch you personally? In this crisis, a couple of very important lessons for us. Communication, knowledge is power. How important it was for us to be communicating every single day, everything, warts and all. Human beings are at the top of the food chain. We like to feel in control of situations. And when situations are out of control, the only thing you can have is information. And it just, I was amazed at how many times people said to me, I felt so much better when I knew that my street was going to flood and how much time I had to get out. And it sounds like a stupid thing to say, but at least I knew what to do then. It was really frightening when I didn't know. So even when I was telling them something terrible, it made them calmer because they then knew what they had to do. From a leadership perspective, these sort of situations are extremely physically demanding. You don't get as much sleep as you need. You are running on high degree of adrenaline. There's lots of stress. There's lots of demands being made on you. You often have to be out in environments for extended periods of time. If there's a fire at a school, you'll often get no sleep for 3 days or 2 days. You're up in the middle of the night, you're out there. They are very physically demanding events, and even if they're not, they don't have to be a school fire. You all know it. If you've been through a big, horrible school grievance between 2 or 3 teachers, they demand emotional and physically something of you. If it's a crisis, by definition, it does not come with a date claimer. If it did, you could plan for it. And so what that really means is that grenades are going to land left field on your watch, and leadership means being prepared for that. It does mean paying some attention to self-care and being aware of that your responsibilities can come at very inconvenient times. Your son or daughter's 21st wedding, 21st birthday, where perhaps you've had 1 whiskey more than you meant to, and suddenly you find the school hall is burning down and you have to be there in an hour. These things happen, and leadership is not a normal life. It means taking responsibility for the position that you hold and being ready at any time, and that does mean that sense of looking after yourself and being ready for when that big thing without the date claimer comes. And the importance of a little of that human touch. The speech that Jim talked about, the Queenslander speech that many people will remember, I was absolutely clear that day. I think every single leader in every environment, whether it's in a school, running a corporation, in government, every single day you walk a very fine line between, on the one hand, authoritative, commanding, firm, chain of command style leadership, and on the other, empathy for the people whose decisions, for whom your decisions will be, life-changing, an understanding of how your staff are feeling, and the ability to hang on to compassion and empathy. And you veer between those two given the circumstances. And I think we all know that anyone too far down that side, people lose confidence in them, too far down this end, and people stop liking them or having any admiration and respect for them. So I was absolutely clear the morning that Brisbane reached its peak of flooding when I gave that speech, and this was after 3 weeks of devastating events where we'd lost many lives in terrifying and frightening situations. I knew that my leadership task that morning as I went to that press conference was to rally the troops. It wasn't to manage the event or to talk about where the sandbags were going. Somebody else would do that. I needed to issue a rallying cry and to make sure that people could reach into themselves with confidence and know that when they faced the devastation of their neighbourhoods, their workplaces, their lives, that we would be able to do it together. And instinctively, I didn't have time to write a long speech about this, but instinctively as a Queenslander, I knew that if something a bit parochial about us as a frontier state, it's that sense that you get when you win the state of origin, what is that thing that will actually appeal to people? There is something very corny and parochial about it, but at moments like that, these are big emotions, that sense that we are tough and we can get up off the mat and we can do the things that need to be done. And what I did not plan, however, was that my voice would break and that I would become quite emotional. So I had this very strong clarity about my job is to rally people, and that means they need to see me strong, in command, authoritative. And in the middle of it, my voice broke, I started to get teary. I'm sure you've all been there when you're giving an important speech, and suddenly you get a lump in your throat and your whole body conspires against you, and the more you try to stop it, the worse it gets. It wasn't, and so I thought I had completely failed in my responsibility. I thought the moment they needed to see me strongest, they saw a blubbering girl in charge, and that they would start to lose confidence in not only me but the whole leadership team. It wasn't until I left that press conference some 40 minutes later, because there was lots of questions, because there were many, many things happening, that I began to understand the effect that it had had. And for me, it was an incredibly important lesson. I think I felt the need for command and authority even more strongly because I was a woman leading in those circumstances, but I think every leader, male and female, grapples with those two sides of the leadership coin. And I understood in a very profound way, because of the reaction that people had to that speech, that there are moments in critical circumstances that, that finding a way to touch the humanity in the people who are experiencing it with you is as critical as making sure the sandbags and the SES choppers and everything else are in the right place. And it can be easy to forget it, because you do go into command mode. And sometimes it's just important to take a step back and say, what do my people need? What's in their hearts? Are they frightened? Are they, how are they feeling? Are they overwhelmed? And people do look for that in leaders as well. I started by saying that leaders are future makers, so I wanted to really finish on recognising a few things about where the immediate future is for this group. If leaders, by their nature, look over the horizon. If you want to make the future, you've got to try and see what's coming next. Look around corners and look over what's happening right in front of you. Much harder to do than you think. But we all know that in this year we're going to see a federal election. Elections in a democracy like ours are incredibly important events to defining what happens, particularly in areas like education. We are going to a federal election in which the current Prime Minister has made the need for Australia to move to an innovation economy a very important plank of his political platform, and an opposition that I think is also embracing the need for an economic shift. As I said earlier, one of the ways I got prepped through was to go to a Premier who wanted to nail his colours to the mast on making Queensland a smart state. I said, you can't do that if the kids have less education. You cannot build an innovation economy. You cannot embrace the economic opportunities of the next decade, the next 2 decades, or of this century, unless you have one of the world's best education systems. And it's people in this room and in your organisation who can define that to Australians in a way that I don't think politicians necessarily can. In some ways, some respects you already have part of that agenda already spelt out. It's an agenda that notionally has bipartisan support, and that's the Gonski reforms. There is an agenda that I think needs to be elevated in the lead up to the next federal election for all sides of politics. This is an agenda that profoundly goes to the opportunity for children, regardless of their circumstances, to experience the truly transformational effects of a good, high-quality education. And to be ignited by that flame that they may not be experiencing in their homes or in other parts of their lives, that flame for knowledge and curiosity. That's what fuels innovation economies. So I really wanted to encourage ACL to think about. I don't know when the next federal election is. Malcolm hasn't rung me. But I do know that it's going to be held sometime between now and September, probably. And that's really, it's 6 or 7 months, and it could be as early as July. So organisations like yours, that if you aspire to leadership in the public debate on an issue like this, need to be focusing now and starting to set the agenda for the entire political class and saying, people like you need to be out there saying, education needs to be one of the top 3 issues that you go to the ballot box within your mind. Dear voting public, education has to be in the top 3. And and you should be putting both major political parties to the blowtorch on these issues. And every PNC should know that. Every stakeholder in the education sector should be talking about that now. leadership is about setting the agenda. As I said, you should be out there now or in the lead up to the, in the not too distant future, talking about those issues. One of the things, going back to building an army, I think that my observation, much more from the outside than the inside this time, was that the whole process around the Gonski reforms built very powerful networks across the education sectors. It built powerful networks between different sectors of schooling, across primary and high school education, across stakeholders like it was a unity of purpose around between teacher unions, principal associations, professional organisations, academia, universities and parent organisations. Those networks are not easy to build. And all too often in politics, I've seen people build those coalitions for a particular purpose. When the purpose is won, the coalition fades away. If I could encourage you as leaders in the sector to do what you can to hang on to those networks and to keep maintaining them, because they're incredibly powerful. As I said, I was on the outside of the Gonski campaign, and I no longer had children at school. But as a sort of observant citizen, it was a constant. I was constantly hearing things that I thought were interesting, important, and that mattered. And I was hearing a really, really broad cross-section of voices. I didn't just hear one. It wasn't just always the teachers' union saying this or the principals' association saying it. And it's so powerful when you're listening to it. I actually got to hear it a lot more than I ever got to when I was in the business of doing it. So I'd hear all this on radio and television and in the newspapers. And the collective effect of that is very, very powerful. So that build an army is a message I wanted to leave with you, because if you've got an army, if you've got the right army and it's well armed, it does start to develop an unstoppable momentum around it. I think across all the states of Australia, we've seen some remarkable leaps forward in the last couple of decades. But we can't keep making those at a state level unless we've got a very powerful commitment at a national level to funding and to thinking about where Australia should go next. So I finish where I started. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. I hope I'm in a room full of fellow pyromaniacs. Thank you.